Cars still look fantastic here. You know, you've got all the skyscrapers around. It's right in the center of Singapore.
For Red Bull to have, these races, they're not chasing the wins often. They're just kind of letting them happen.
Before they become Audi, a full Audi works team with an Audi engine in 2026.
I don't think it's pressure internally on Stroll, but this is the kind of race where you look at someone like Lance Stroll and you think it's a real test of a driver.
Welcome to Unlapped ahead of the Singapore Grand Prix. I'm Katie George alongside Nate Saunders and Laurence Edmondson. Laurence just touched down in Singapore. Before we get you into our preview, I have to ask, friend of the podcast, Chris Medlin, just got married over the weekend. How was it, gentlemen?
Yeah, it was awesome. Really, really great wedding in Hereford, which was a random location for it to be. But yeah, beautiful day, beautiful venue. Laurence has a better story than me, though, because he actually participated in a huge way of getting a very important part of the wedding to the wedding. So I'll let him carry that on. But it's a very, very cool addition to the whole thing.
Well, you said that, Nate. I think you gave a very important contribution because you did one of two best man speeches. And,
yeah, that's true. I wasn't officially the best man, but I stepped in to the role.
Yes. Chris did this modern thing now where you split the best man duties between various people. And so, there were two speeches. I think it was Jess's stepdad who gave the rings over during the ceremony. I had the very difficult job of signing the register, which I did excellently, I'd like to add. And but I also had the very lucky job of driving the wedding car to the event. And the wedding car was a surprise, and it was a AC Cobra replica. And so I had to drive that all the way from Clapham Junction in London to Hereford, which is a good kind of 4 hours, especially when you stop for fuel and the rest of it. But I was blessed with beautiful weather, as was the wedding day itself. And a lot of fun in what is a quite temperamental, but incredibly fun car to drive that gets lots of good looks along the way. If you're on social media, and you can check out either Chris Medlin's Instagram or now Jess Medlin's Instagram. I'm not sure if she's changed it to Jess Medlin. It may still be Jess McFadden. Either of their Instagrams, and see the AC Cobra if you're into that kind of thing. And of course, some beautiful wedding pictures.
So real quick, I don't want to digress too much, but how did these roles come about? Because to me, no offense, Nate, Laurence seems like the perfect person for his role, because I don't think I would trust you to get that car from London 4 hours where it needed to be on wedding day on time. You would forget something, I think. But you stepping in and giving a speech feels like a good role for you as well.
Yeah, I would have, if you'd asked me to drive the car, I'd have politely declined and said, mate, you don't want me to do it. The speech was more in my lane, I think, and I think it went pretty well. Everyone seemed to really like it, and I had about an hour where I just didn't drink anything, before you do it. And then the closer we got to it, I was like, I think I need to drink a glass of wine. So I had a very big glass of white wine before I went up, and it did the trick perfectly. So no nerves. It was just the right amount. So yeah, I think both of us did it pretty well. But it's a good division of labor at a wedding. I think Meta seemed to have about 10 different people doing different things, and it worked really well.
That's awesome. Yeah, the build up to your speech, if you have to give a speech at a wedding, is always the worst. Like, you can't enjoy any part of the wedding until after your speech has been over, done with, you get applause, and then you can really let loose, which I'm sure you did. Remember, that's awesome, guys. Remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, please hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It means a great deal to us. Let's hit our Grand Prix preview. All right, Laurence, we're going to Singapore. You're obviously there in your swanky, sleek, modern hotel. Can you give us just a breakdown of the Marina Bay circuit and what to expect this weekend?
Yeah, well, it's changed slightly this year. For the first time since it first came on the calendar in 2008, it's changed. And to go back to that 2008 race, it was the first night race in F1. And it's kind of got this now legendary status as one of the great street circuits in F1 and the original night race. And the cars still look fantastic here. You've got all the skyscrapers around. It's right in the center of Singapore. If you were going to do a street race, every now and again we see new street races slightly out of the center of a city, but this one is bang in the middle of it, and you really kind of get a feel for the city as the cars are driving around. So yeah, they've changed it slightly. They've taken 4 corners out, all in the final sector, and created a long straight instead. That's because they're redeveloping an area where they had a grandstand which basically faced out into the harbour area, and the track used to loop around that, so used to come around in front of it and then go underneath the grandstand. And famously, that was where Nelson Piquet Jr. crashed on purpose in that first race in 2008 to swing it in the favour of his teammate Fernando Alonso in what later became known as Crashgate. So there's a bit of history in this race, but more than anything else, it is a really tough challenge for the drivers. Lando Norris was speaking at an event today I was at. McLaren released their new livery for this weekend and next weekend in Japan. They've gone into what they call stealth mode, so it's all kind of bare carbon fiber and orange, and it's quite cool. But he was saying at last year's race, he lost 3 kilos in weight, which is not an insignificant amount. And also because, remember, a lot of these drivers, are kind of weigh as little as kind of 60 to 70 kilos. So you're talking about a big percentage of weight loss to the point that it's actually it actually becomes an issue. Concentrating still once you've lost that much, we've had that much dehydration going on in your body is incredibly difficult. So the drivers have lots of different ways of trying to keep themselves healthy and keep themselves hydrated, and then also just deal with the inevitable heat stress as well that comes with just trying to dissipate that amount of heat as they go around the track.
Do you think, Nate, that this is the toughest physical test on the circuit, or on the calendar, I should say?
Yeah, I think so. You often hear that from the drivers. Just try to remember if this was the place where Kimi was famously told, Kimi, you will not have the drink, or if that was another place when his water bottle didn't work. But there's been times when drivers have finished Singapore and their water bottle hasn't worked, and you can see, they almost have to be pulled out of the car. It's that bad. So I think I'm trying to think of any others that drivers say are as challenging, but Singapore is right up there because it has all of those elements to kind of really test the drivers, as Laurence mentioned. So it's pretty intense, and I think just a great event, a fantastic event. And it's one of those that the drivers should be in a position where they're challenged like that, because obviously this is the pinnacle of racing, and I think that's one of the reasons that adds a bit of a bonus to it. They feel at the end of a Singapore Grand Prix, I think they feel like we've really achieved something, on top of all the other feelings you probably have at the end of a Grand Prix.
The only one that ever came close was Malaysia, which geographically is very close. So we're just north of the equator in Singapore, and the race in Malaysia was a little bit further north. But they held that during the day. So not only did you have the humidity and the heat that hangs around this part of the world, but you had the sunlight as well. So that was always a really tough one. But going back to this race, I think it was 2014. Kevin Magnussen was telling this story last year or a few years ago about how he had a radiator leak, and so a very small one, but enough that it was kind of, the car was basically pumping even more hot air and kind of steam into his cockpit. And he said that he got out, I think he had some kind of burns, not too serious, but some burns on his back. And he said that he was driving around there just waiting to black out because the situation in the cockpit was so bad. But he still finished 10th in that race and got a point. But he said he was absolutely ruined afterwards. So yeah, it is one of the toughest, if not, I think it is now the toughest physical challenge on the F1 calendar.
I know you guys experienced Miami in May, which is a little bit different, but for our American listeners and viewers, like Miami in August and September, I was just there a weekend to go for college football. Like, you step out of the car or walk out of the hotel and it's so swampy and muggy because of the humidity. It feels like you're taking a bath while you walk outside. Does it feel like that? Is it 10 times that? Like, what's a comparable other than Malaysia, just for, people across the pond?
Yeah, I'd say Miami is the closest I've come to it at another race. It's a really good point, actually. Miami is very hot. I think the nature of this circuit kind of makes it more difficult as well. It's just corner after corner after corner. Not necessarily a long lap. It's only 5 kilometers. What about kind of just over 3 miles or so? But this race takes a long time. It's a relatively slow track, which means to cover the race distance, which this year has gone up 1 lap to 62 laps over 61 because of the changes to the track, takes sometimes the full 2 hours, especially once you have safety cars thrown in there as well. So yeah, I'd say Miami is a very fair comparison, but the humidity levels do feel a little bit higher even here than there. But either way, some drivers actually to train do quite literally bring a cycle bike or a rower machine into a sauna and train in the sauna to try and replicate the humidity and get their body used to the humidity. Because talking to some of the trainers, if you kind of start preparing a couple of weeks out or even a week out, and you start say running in the south of France where it's still quite hot this time of year, but wearing a hoodie or quite thick jogging trousers and stuff like that, you can start to adapt the body to what it's going to have to deal with here. But if you were just thrown straight in to this race, even an elite racing driver like the ones we have in Formula One, without any preparation, that they would struggle, especially in the second half of the race. It's the second half of the race where they can all the tricks they've done before by trying to reduce body temperature with ice vests and kind of ice around their neck and towels and stuff like that. All of those advantages start to wear off. And as Nate mentioned, the drinks bottle by that point may be dry, may not be working at all. And that's where it really hits. And so if you see, drivers make uncharacteristic errors at this circuit, while it's impossible to say it was absolutely linked to dehydration and heat stress, it's often a concern. It's certainly something that the driver trainers are trying to eliminate as much as they can.
So it's physically grueling. It's a tricky layout. And obviously management of tire conditions becomes very, very important in this climate. As we look to Red Bull to continue its unbelievable streak, which Helmut Marko recently said, which I think is interesting, if we win in Singapore, then the chance is there that we can win all the races. Of course, it's becoming a goal now. Early on in the season, it felt like the team was kind of hedging. That's not our focus. There's still a long season ahead of us. But it kind of feels like, Nate, that Singapore is kind of the catalyst. If we can win here, then yeah, we probably can win them all. Is this the toughest track for Red Bull that we'll see?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that Mercedes often found that this was one of the ones when they were dominating, they had a few years where they struggled at, and they worked hard to fix those problems. But I kind of agree with them. If you look at the remaining races now, the one that stands out where you could, especially just the nature of the circuit as well, where you may have issues, you might not have either driver finish. Yeah, I would say I agree with that. And it's interesting as well that he's actually admitted that, Marko, because Red Bull have been very clever at not playing that up. They've downplayed the unbeaten season as much as possible. Obviously, Marko's a bit of a loose cannon, it's fair to say. So I'm not sure if that's been something that Christian Horner will admit to this weekend. But yeah, I think win this one, win Suzuka as well, which is obviously 7 days after. And I think it would take something. It would take reliability. I think at this point anyway, it will take reliability to stop them winning. But you get past those two races, and I think that you can start to rest a bit easier looking at what's left on the calendar. Although Vegas might be, Vegas is just such a wild card event that might be up there as well.
Max even admitted after Monza that Singapore is going to be a little bit more difficult. Might not be the strongest weekend for us. Why does he feel that way, Laurence?
It's a good question. I think it's because if you look at the most similar track to Singapore, it's probably Baku, and they were out-qualified by Ferrari there. So while this is a little bit different, it's real high downforce, which doesn't really suit the Ferrari. It could be a weakness, and I don't know. I feel like there's there's all the environmental kind of issues that you have in racing in this heat that could lead to failures and so on. So perhaps there's a bit of that. But I think we're talking about, okay, there's a very slight chance that this could be the most likely one they lose out on. But they've been winning races by 20-30 seconds.
Yeah.
So as much as I'd like to sit here and say, Red Bull are going to be challenged, and they're going to have Mercedes and Aston Martins and Ferraris crawling all over them throughout the race, I don't think that's the case. I think it is the case that their car, which has been mightily fast everywhere, sometimes in the race, certainly by margins that we haven't seen for many, many years, I can't see that all turning around just on by looking at the layout of this track or the conditions of this track. But I guess if you're looking at a ranking of which circuits they're most likely to struggle on before the end of the year, then perhaps this one would be at the top.
And Max, I think one thing we've seen from him is that I think he'd already got the trait. He was kind of refining it, but he knows that as well now, which I think is key. Like you look at Monza, he obviously had a bit of a go trying to get past Sainz, but he knew he could wait, let that race come to him. And I think that ultimately even if he has a bad start, qualifies poorly, I think there's going to be a knowledge that, like, just let this race come to us. I think Perez, to a lesser degree, probably knows that as well. I mean, he should be coming through the field as well. So that's a huge mental gain for Red Bull to have. At these races, they're not chasing the wins often. They're just kind of letting them happen, which I think is a huge relief for them going into races, because it's just one less thing you got to worry about.
Nate, are you expecting a big weekend from Sergio Perez? Obviously, we know he's had success on street circuits in the past.
Yeah, well, there was a time, wasn't there? We were calling him the Street King. That seems like a long time ago now. And I think, to be honest with you, I am, because I think that even though he's had a bad spell, if you look back to the 2 wins this season, he had Saudi and he had Baku. So 2 circuits, in similar conditions to this. And if you look at where he's been strongest when he's been at Red Bull, he has been strongest on street circuits. Now, obviously, the crash in Monaco is kind of what triggered this horrible downturn in form. But I feel like Perez is over the worst of that now. He's kind of come out the other end. Red Bull, to their credit, I think, kind of didn't, quite uncharacteristically for them, given some of other teammates Verstappen's had, they didn't immediately throw him to the lion's den. They said, we think he'll come back. They kept kind of extending, even though they were kind of giving him little jabs, but they were also saying, we think he's going to come out of it. And he slowly, I don't think he's performing anywhere as good as he should, just to clarify, because he's in such a good car. But if you look at his performances compared to where they were 2 months ago, he's in a much better space. So he should come to Singapore. He should remember hopefully remember this is one of the places he should go well at. And he's got the best car underneath him. So I'm hoping so. And I think, I don't know, there was obviously some, Marko had to roll back from some pretty offensive comments he made last week about Perez. I hope he comes kind of with renewed kind of motivation and vigor to kind of shut Marko up a little bit. There's been a lot of things said back and forth, not necessarily from Christian Horner, actually. It's mainly come from Helmut Marko. But hopefully that's fired him up. And obviously as well, everyone's talking about when Max is going to win the championship. We know he's going to win it. I feel like if you're Perez, you want to kind of go down fighting, even if Max does win it in Qatar, with a few races left. You kind of want to go out. You don't want to go out with a whimper. You want to be like, I still want to race before he won the championship. It's very difficult to see that happening given Max's form. But if you're Perez, you've got to back yourself. And I think just for the sake of an entertaining couple of races, I'm hoping he can do it, because also Perez, we haven't seen it for so long, but when Perez really nails it, he's really capable of having these really, really great weekends. And his problem has been, he's just, especially this season, has just not been able to make them consistent at all. He's had maybe he had the 2 races where he won this year, but obviously Max had, I think he had a penalty at one, started down the order for the other one. As far as I remember, it might have been penalties at both. So, hard to see him beating Max Verstappen if they go toe to toe. But I think if you're Perez right now, you've just got to put yourself in the conversation, put yourself on the front row with Max, and just try and take the fight to him, because that's, at the moment, that's what everyone wants to see him do.
Regardless of if Perez is in the conversation for a podium or not, we've come to expect that Max Verstappen is certainly going to be up there. But the fight behind for podiums has been pretty interesting, week in and week out. Laurence, Mercedes feels like this track layout possibly could favor their car. What are your expectations for who will be in a legitimate spot to fight for a podium in Singapore out of Mercedes, Aston Martin, McLaren? I know you mentioned Ferrari earlier, but just based on the way that this circuit is laid out and the cars, how they have fared in, recent races, who do you expect to really be up there?
Yeah, I think if you look at the form book on these types of track, you'd probably go with Mercedes and Aston Martin. When the downforce kind of gets put back on the cars with the biggest possible rear wing and a decent sized front wing as well, and that's when Mercedes and Aston Martin have looked at their best. Ferrari is almost the opposite. When you strip the downforce away from that car, it relatively performs better to the others. But of course, there's no point in stripping downforce away for the sake of it. You need a circuit where that's going to give you an advantage, and Monza was exactly that, which is why we think that Ferrari was so fast there compared to recent tracks. So yeah, I think there is maybe an argument for Ferrari, as I said earlier, in the Baku, a fairly similar street circuit with 90-degree corners, much like we have here. Charles Leclerc was on pole. The car was very quick. So that nature of corner, so the 90-degree corners, perhaps does suit Ferrari to some extent. But I think it's like, it's like all these races at the moment, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it really does depend on getting setups right early on, drivers feeling confident, especially here. It's a big confidence circuit. The walls are very close. It's not quite as tight and narrow as Monaco, but it doesn't take much for a small mistake to turn into a big mistake in the barriers. So those are key factors, and so a lot of it will be down to which teams can get running straight away. I think the removal of the 4 corners in the final sector under this new layout and the longer straight will probably help Ferrari to some extent relative to the others, but I'm not sure if it'll be quite enough to get them ahead of Mercedes and Aston Martin, who I would say are probably the two that you're looking at for this track.
We'll see, because obviously they want to build off the momentum that they created and generated in Monza, which was so much fun to see. When you look, Nate, at the best of the rest, what other drivers do you have your eye on? We've got 3 rookies making their debut at a very tough track, and Liam Lawson, Oscar Piastri, and Logan Sargent. Who will you be, keying in on to see how they perform at the circuit?
Well, I think all 3 of those guys are really interesting ones to watch for that exact reason. I mean, Lawson is a fascinating situation because Ricciardo's still not back yet from that hand injury he got at Zandvoort. And this is a really good opportunity for someone like Lawson to kind of show what they can do. It's a really tough circuit. If you can come through, I think he impressed at Monza, but if you can come through Singapore, even if you can snatch a point, even if he doesn't, it's one of those weekends where if you can keep the car out of the wall, if you can just impress the guys that are putting you in that seat, I think it could stand him in good stead for next year, assuming he's still in the contention for that. I think he's got an outside chance. What I'm interested to see how McLaren does here, because obviously we've seen McLaren go up earlier in the season. This is a circuit where you look at them and you think, given everything we know about the car, it shouldn't be, or everything we knew about the car anyway, it shouldn't be such a good weekend. But we'll kind of see where they're at, because they had that great spell where they came back with the podiums. Things haven't quite gone their way, the last 2 races, but I'm curious to see what they can do. And to be honest with you, I think one of the great things about this race is that you always get some, either in qualifying or in the race, you get somebody completely out of position, and you end up seeing really scrappy fights. I mean, I was watching a montage this morning of when Schumacher basically tried to barge his way through. This was kind of Schumacher version 2. It wasn't the Schumacher who won all those championships, and I forget who he's driving past. But he basically just drives straight ahead and just pushes the guy into the wall. And you do see some really brilliant overtaking at Singapore, but you can see really desperate drivers getting very, very clumsy with their overtakes later in the race as well. And I think a lot of that does go to what Laurence was saying about the condition they're in as well. So especially for those rookies, it's a real mental test as much as anything. So yeah, I think a lot of drivers are going to either stand out or they'll look really, really bad. We mentioned Aston Martin as well. I think it's growing. I don't think it's pressure internally on Stroll, but this is the kind of race where you look at someone like Lance Stroll and you think it's a real test of a driver. I think Alonso's going to do very well. He's always, I think one of his best wins was in Singapore. And I think a guy like Stroll really is going to be magnified against his teammate, if he doesn't do well. So things like that you're always looking out for.
Laurence, what are your expectations from Alex Albon and Williams? You got points in back-to-back races. Williams has now jumped Alfa Romeo and Haas in the constructors standings. He seems to be like he's in great form. When you talk about the physical tests of this, is he up to task?
Oh yeah, definitely. He's more. He'll get the best out of whatever the car can do. My concern being that the car might struggle around here relative to Monza. But we said that about other circuits, and the Williams kind of came good. Zandvoort, it was surprisingly quick on a high downforce track. So it's interesting now because Williams, I think so many of us have got in our heads, because after so many seasons of them struggling, that they are the backmark team, but they're 7th in the championship now, and they're leading that group of kind of 4 teams which are a long way off the 6 above. Williams, Haas, Alfa Romeo, and AlphaTauri. And so I think they're 10 points clear now of Haas in that battle, and all of those points, all 21 of the points that Williams have, are Alex Albon's. So there's a bit of pressure on Sargent to perform, but I don't think they'll be going to this track thinking, here's a chance to double down on our advantage. I think it'll be a case of making sure they have a clean weekend to try and get the car as good as they possibly can, because there is a possibility that this race turns into one of attrition, at which point, you can get cars which are less competitive scoring points. So I guess that will be the plan. But yeah, like I said, Williams was surprised us so many times this year. Sorry, that I wouldn't put it past them doing it again.
I just wanted to clarify. I just had to double check the year. When I said it was one of Alonso's best wins, I obviously didn't mean 2008, which was when his teammate crashed, so he won it. It was 2010 Singapore Grand Prix, held Vettel off the whole race. But I was just trying to remember the year that was. I was like, it's either 10 or 12, and I wanted to double check it. Just before people think that I think somehow Alonso's Crashgate win was one of the crowning moments of his career, because it definitely wasn't.
A good distinction.
And you know how people are on Twitter. Somebody would have sent me a message being like, "Well, actually, you shouldn't have won the race."
100%.
Like, Felipe Massa burner account, probably.
A good distinction. Thank you.
Yeah.
A couple other bits of news. Obviously, with Mercedes renewing Lewis Hamilton and George Russell's contracts through 2025, we now have 4 open seats that remain. Joe Granu is close, possibly. There are reports, Laurence, that he's getting close to re-upping with Alfa Romeo. What do we know about that? And then obviously we'll maybe hit the other 3 seats.
Yeah, his contract expires at the end of this year, so he needs to sign a new one if he's going to stay in F1. The noises have been fairly good throughout the season that he'll stay there, but the threat for Joe for that seat is Théo Pourchaire, who is a Sauber junior driver competing in Formula 2 and leading the Formula 2 Championship at the moment. It looks like he'll win it, and so that would definitely throw his hat in the ring there. Alfa Romeo, Sauber, they won't actually be called Alfa Romeo next year. That sponsorship deal will come to an end, so it'll be Sauber next year, and they'll be in this weird kind of transition period for 2 years, 24 and 25, before they become Audi, a full Audi works team with an Audi engine in 2026. So it's a strange situation. They've got Valtteri under contract for another year, Valtteri Bottas, but they also need to start looking at who they're going to line up long term, so that when 2026 does roll around, they've got drivers that kind of meet the aspirations that they have, which will be, I mean, I don't know whether they'll be able to do it straight out of the box. It'll be very unlikely, I think, but they'll certainly be targeting, podiums, wins, and eventually titles. And so they'll want a driver who's capable of doing that. And so, there's lots of rumors that swirl around. Carlos Sainz often gets linked to that team. I've heard Lando Norris be linked to that team before as well. But we're now, that's a little bit further down the road. So if they keep Joe in the car for another year, I think it makes a certain amount of sense because, he is now operating at a level which I don't think is quite on the standard as of Valtteri. I don't think he's quite got the pace, and he doesn't quite seem to get the same amount of points by the end of the year. But he's not a million miles off. And so if you bring in a rookie, even Pourchaire, who does look good, there's just that risk that you end up throwing away a few points here and there. And as we know, that can cost a lot of money in the prize fund from the Constructors' Championship. So yeah, I'd say Joe is a safe pair of hands going forward. And if that's the mentality of that team, just to see them through this period before they start really hunting bigger name drivers, I could see that coming together fairly soon.
That leaves Logan Sargent, and then neither driver for AlphaTauri is still confirmed for next season. So dealer's choice, Nate, where would you like to go with that, and what are your expectations?
I mean, Laurence is going to think I'm going to take the Ricciardo one, but I'm not. I'm going to say Logan Sargent. I think we've mentioned this before. If you'd asked me 3 months ago, I'd have said Sargent's a shoo-in for another seat next season. It always seemed like, that obviously they'd had him before he came into Formula One. He was affiliated with Williams, American owners there, but he hasn't performed in the way that they wanted him to. And Laurence is absolutely right what he said earlier. All the points have gone to Albon. It wouldn't have actually made a difference to their championship because Alpine are so much further ahead in the next slot, but it has left them vulnerable to the teams below them. And I think that is a big, big deal. It's interesting there. I think that the one thing that I think might take it away from Sargent is the fact that James Vowles has gone there. We've heard Toto Wolff say over and over again that he thinks that Mick Schumacher should be in Formula One. I don't necessarily agree that Mick showed enough at Haas for that to be the case. But it's interesting to see now if Vowles' relationship with Wolff means that Mick comes into that car. But Mick's another interesting one. I don't think Mick did enough at Haas to really prove either way. I mean, you look at it. Do you want to take Logan Sargent? Do you want to take Mick Schumacher? I think either of those, it's kind of, they're both a bit of kind of a, shrug your shoulders kind of meh kind of thing. So I don't know whether Williams will be convinced to go in that direction or not. But certainly Logan Sargent, the noise around that team is that it's not as certain as it once was. And then AlphaTauri is a really fascinating one. I still think Ricciardo's kind of got the seat locked down if he wants it. I think the injuries probably complicated it a little bit, but if you're the and you look at this from a wider perspective, if you're the company that are coming in and buying AlphaTauri and you're becoming the title sponsor, we believe it could be Hugo Boss. There's a few other companies involved there. Do you want a guy like, I say a guy like Liam Lawson. What I mean is a rookie like Liam Lawson's not very well known, hasn't been in a series of Netflix. Or do you want Daniel Ricciardo in that car? Probably behind Lewis, behind maybe one or two others, probably the most marketable guy in F1 still. I think that alone wins it for Ricciardo, and the fact that he came back was very, very good in those first two races he had back with him. And then be difficult to see them get rid of Tsunoda. So I don't know, Lawson on the sidelines again, but it's tough, isn't it? Because he's so far has shown he's acquitted himself pretty well. So that is a really fascinating one. And I think that Red Bull have kind of inadvertently ended up in a situation where we've got a real headache with that decision, because it wasn't meant to be they had three drivers going for those two seats. It was meant to be Ricciardo comes back and then we've got him for a year and a half in AlphaTauri. We'll deal with it down the line. Even though Ricciardo's deal is to the end of this year, I've always felt that it was like, prove yourself this year. If you can't do it, we'll put Lawson in. If you can do it, we'll keep you in for another year. And then you can try and get the Red Bull seat when Perez is gone. But Lawson coming in is just complicated it a bit. And I don't know, Laurence might have heard differently since he's got to Singapore, but it does seem still like it's very much an open question around, what Lawson does beyond this stint in the car.
Laz, if you were running AlphaTauri, what driver pairing would you go with?
Well, definitely stick with Tsunoda, because I think, he's been very good this year. And I think a lot of the weaknesses that he had in previous seasons, he's addressed. And really, when the car is at the back of the field like that, you can only really judge them against teammates. And all three teammates he's now had this year, I mean, admittedly, two of them have only just kind of got back, or Ricciardo back into F1, Lawson into F1. So it's not a direct comparison, but I think he's looked very solid either way. And then, it is a difficult decision. I completely agree with what Nate said about the value of Ricciardo in the car. And really, I do want Ricciardo to be given this chance, especially with what's happened recently with the broken hand and the recovery from that. I would like to see him given a full go at it, because otherwise it's going to be a massive what if, certainly in his head, but I think in a lot of people's heads. But then equally, Lawson's performances so far have been very good. And I guess, the next two races, if it was actually me making the decision, I would look at the next two races, which we're expecting both to be driven by Lawson before Ricciardo targets Qatar to come back. Hopefully, it's not guaranteed at all, but hopefully. And then see what the performances are like. And if Lawson does something which is so standout and so brilliant, or even if it's not that from the outside, but the engineering team can see it from the inside, then you'd start to see what you do between Lawson and Ricciardo and make it cool. But I would probably go Tsunoda Ricciardo, but it does seem harsh on Lawson because he's done a great job coming in.
Yeah, and he's kind of it's such a difficult decision for them as well, because I don't want to say the future of the driver program hinges on this, but if you pick an old, a guy who's 34 over Lawson 21, part of your driver academy, you kind of then question what is the point of having that driver academy there. So they have left themselves in a funny position. I wonder as well if it was under a different time at Williams, but when Albon went to Williams, he went still affiliated to Red Bull. I wonder if the solution here is for Red Bull, you try and get Lawson. You say to Williams, look, you've obviously got an issue there with Sargent. We can pay, put Lawson in this seat. Create a situation where he's still driving there. He's still got the Red Bull branding on. That was obviously a deal done, in a different time at Williams, but you wonder whether they'd be open to the same thing. You got a young, hungry rookie there, a guy that Red Bull believe in enough to have kept him part of the program. I don't know. That might be a way around it, but again, complicated with the politics in Formula One. You never know how open those possibilities are. But at the moment, that is one way. The only way all three of those drivers will be on the grid next year is if they can kind of farm Lawson out to Williams.
That's exactly where my mind went. If you're going to move on from Logan Sargent, do you then try to grab Liam Lawson if AlphaTauri sticks with Daniel Ricciardo? And to be fair, Liam Lawson, as you guys have pointed out, has performed extremely well in an AlphaTauri. And obviously we know what Alex Albon's being able to get out of the Williams. So you'd hope that a competent, good young driver, although, we all hope that about Logan Sargent, he hasn't put the results together. You hope Lawson would be able to get into a Williams and possibly do the same. So certainly a lot to watch out for from those next 4 seats. As we mentioned, Joe Granu might be close to re-upping with Alfa Romeo, eventually Sauber. Prediction time, my favorite portion of the show. I'm going to recap where we stand for our viewers and our listeners. Laurence, you were at the top of the pops with 36 points. Nate, a close second with 34 points. Katie Trails at 29 points.
However,
yeah,
I was going to say, I thought you were going to not give yourself credit again for missing
I'm
the first 2, but I think, yeah. But no, you did miss two races, so
I did.
Big asterisk next to your name.
Asterisk.
I would say.
Okay, I appreciate that. But because Laurence sits at the top, he gets to choose first. And I really hope you go for it. Just like really go out there, really just factor in reliability issues, just gamble with this one because you got the points to be able to do it, Laurence.
No, that's exactly what I did in Monza, and it backfired terribly. And Nate got within 2 points. So now I'm playing the percentages now. I'm consolidating my lead. I'm going really boring. Max Verstappen wins. Okay. Checo Perez second. Lewis Hamilton third.
Wow. All right. I dig it. Nathaniel?
On a high from last time out when I got all 3, I'm going to go risky. I'm going to, for the first time in about 15 races, well, not 15 races, but however long it's been.
Power.
Yeah, I think so. Completely unrealistically as well. I'm going to say Perez wins, Return of the Street King, Fernando Alonso second, Lewis Hamilton third. That would be a great race. So I think at this point I'm going for most entertaining race over most realistic race outcome.
Not that you have to put this in your predictions, but what has happened to Max Verstappen? Just want to.
He is leading by 78 seconds, and then he goes to lap Logan Sargent, and the two of them collide, and then Max finishes 4th because he's got such a big lead he can crawl back with like half a wing, 3 tires, but he doesn't win the race.
That would be a hell of a script.
If that all comes off, I think I win automatically. If that all step by step is what happens, I think we just cancel the game. Did you see a quick one? Some guy tweeted about an hour before the Jets played the other night. He was like, "Oh, imagine in an hour if Rodgers is sitting on the turf at MetLife with a snapped Achilles," and everyone's tweeting it out. There was some, I don't know, there was some tweet going around, and people were like, "What? What's the price of Bitcoin going to be next year?" Like I maybe I got hoodwinked by a fake tweet, but I saw that and I was like, that guy either was very lucky with his prediction or has some kind of weird sadistic crystal ball in his house about the Jets. I'll find the tweet and I'll send it to you.
Find the tweet and send it to me because I would like to see that. Because that was an unbelievable
it's crazy
sequence of events. If you're an NFL fan, which I know both of you know because of your draft, you are. But I mean, anyways, we could do a whole podcast on that.
Sorry, massive tangent for me. Apologies.
Yes. Well, a good one. Okay. I'm going to go with Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, followed by Fernando Alonso. Just give me all the champions on the podium in Singapore. Okay.
Love that.
Yeah. We shall see. I don't have a whole lot of points to play with here, so I can't get really out there. I got to stay within the box. All right, gentlemen. You have to go to bed. What time is it in Singapore? Are you staying up? What's your schedule?
It's 5 to 11, but because it's a night race, what a lot of people do is stay on a European schedule. So you stay on European time, which would make it roughly
coming up to 4 p.m. Yeah, 4 p.m.
Yeah, coming up to 4 p.m. So I'll probably go out and get some dinner, meet up with some other journalists, and might hit the hay at about 2 a.m., 3 a.m.
Oof.
Yeah. But then I won't get up the next day until, I don't know, 1 p.m. It's a bit weird. But the problem is I'm then going to Japan. Not that it's a problem, but I'm then going to Japan. And if you leave yourself on European time, you completely screw yourself for getting to Japan. So I've got to figure out a strategy, which, as you can probably tell, I don't have in place right now.
I was going to say, we'll leave you to
other
that.
Than dinner.
Get some food and we'll leave you to that strategy. Godspeed. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment and give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate you. Enjoy Singapore. Laurence, we can't wait to hear your thoughts on the race. We'll be back next week with Unlapped. Thanks for listening. Cheers.